What if I told you that before recorded history, kings ruled not for decades but for thousands of years? What if the timeline of human civilization is not what we've been taught? Hidden in the dust of ancient Mesopotamia lies a tablet so controversial, so impossible that scholars have spent over a century trying to explain it away. It speaks of 8 kings who ruled for a combined 241,000 years before a great flood swept over the earth. This is not mythology. This is recorded history. But the question that haunts every researcher who touches this artifact is simple and terrifying. What if they're telling the truth? Before we descend into this mystery, take a moment to breathe. Let the stillness find you. And if this journey resonates with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing. Tell me too where you're watching from and what time it is beneath your sky. Your presence here matters. The story begins in southern Iraq, in the region once called Mesopotamia, the land between 2 rivers. In the early 20th century, archaeologists digging through layers of ancient cities unearthed something that would challenge everything we thought we knew about human history. Among the thousands of clay tablets written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script of the ancient world, they found a document unlike any other. It was called the Sumerian King List. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple chronology, a record of rulers who had governed the earliest cities of Sumer. But as scholars began to translate the text, they realized they were holding something far stranger than a royal genealogy. This was a document that refused to obey the laws of time itself. The King List begins with a declaration that sends chills down the spine of anyone who reads it. When kingship descended from heaven, it descended in Eridu. That single sentence contains worlds of meaning. Kingship did not begin through human effort or political evolution. It descended, given from above, a gift or perhaps an imposition from forces beyond human understanding. And it descended in Eridu, the oldest city in Sumerian tradition. A place so ancient that even the Sumerians themselves spoke of it with reverence as the beginning of all things. But it is what comes next that has troubled historians for over a century. The tablet lists the names of 8 kings who ruled before the Great Flood: Alulim of Eridu, Alalgar, Enmen-Luana, Enmen-Galana, Dumuzi the shepherd, and others whose names echo like thunder from an impossible past. Beside each name stands a number that shatters all logic. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, Alalgar for 36,000, Enmen-Luana for 43,200. Together, these 8 kings ruled for a total of 241,200 years. When scholars first encountered these numbers, they assumed there had been a mistake in translation. Perhaps the scribes had used a different counting system. Perhaps the numbers were symbolic, representing dynasties rather than individuals. Perhaps the entire document was mythological allegory, not meant to be taken literally. But as more copies of the King List were discovered in different cities, written by different scribes, separated by centuries, the numbers remained consistent. 241,200 years. The ancient world was telling us something, and that message had been carved into clay tablets meant to last forever. The Sumerians were not a primitive people prone to wild exaggeration. They were meticulous record keepers who invented writing itself specifically to keep track of information. Their mathematical system based on the number 60 was so sophisticated that we still use it today to measure time and angles. They mapped the heavens with precision that would not be matched for millennia. They built irrigation systems, developed legal codes, and created art of stunning beauty and complexity. These were not people who wrote carelessly or without purpose. So why would they record the reigns of kings lasting tens of thousands of years? What were they trying to tell us? Some scholars suggested that the numbers represented astronomical cycles, that each king's reign corresponded to a celestial period too vast for ordinary human comprehension. Others proposed that the names represented entire dynasties, collapsed into single figures for the sake of narrative simplicity. Still others dismissed the entire pre-flood section as pure mythology, a creation story with no basis in historical fact. But there was something that none of these explanations could address. After listing the 8 antediluvian kings and their impossible reigns, the king list states simply, "Then the flood swept over." And after that extraordinary statement, the document continues with a second list of kings. These post-flood rulers have reigns measured in hundreds of years, then decades, then normal human lifespans. Many of these later kings are historically verified. We have archaeological evidence of their cities, their buildings, their wars. The king list transitions seamlessly from the impossible to the real, from myth to history, with no clear boundary between the two. It was as though the ancient scribes were saying, yes, we know these numbers seem impossible, but this is what happened. Before the flood, the world was different. Time moved differently. Rulers were different. And then everything changed. The flood came and the world as it had been was swept away, leaving only fragments and memories inscribed in clay. The question that haunts us is not whether the Sumerians believed these records. Clearly, they did, or they would not have copied and preserved them for over 1,000 years. The question is, what were they remembering? What truth lies buried beneath numbers so large they defy human comprehension? To understand the king list, we must first understand the Sumerians themselves, who they were, where they came from, and why their civilization appeared so suddenly and so completely formed. The Sumerians emerged into history around 4000 BCE in southern Mesopotamia, in the region that is now southern Iraq. But emerged is perhaps the wrong word, because it implies a gradual development from simpler forms. The Sumerians did not emerge. They appeared suddenly and without warning, with a fully developed civilization already in place. They had cities, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, each with populations in the tens of thousands. They had massive temple complexes called ziggurats, stepped pyramids that reached toward the heavens. They had sophisticated irrigation systems that turned desert into farmland. They had writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and art. All of this appeared within a relatively brief period, archaeologically speaking, as if someone had simply decided to build a civilization from scratch. This sudden appearance has puzzled archaeologists for decades. Most civilizations develop gradually, progressing through identifiable stages from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled farmers to urban dwellers. But the Sumerians seem to have skipped these intermediate steps. One moment, there are scattered Neolithic villages in Mesopotamia, and the next moment, there are fully functioning city-states with complex bureaucracies and advanced technologies. It is as if they remembered how to build a civilization rather than figuring it out through trial and error. The Sumerians themselves claimed that their knowledge came from the gods. According to their myths, the god Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh water, taught humanity the arts of civilization. He gave them writing, showed them how to build cities, revealed to them the secrets of mathematics and astronomy. These gifts were called the Me, divine decrees that governed every aspect of civilized life. Without the Me, the Sumerians believed, humanity would revert to chaos and barbarism. But what if these myths contained a kernel of historical truth? What if the Sumerians were not inventing their civilization from nothing, but rather recovering knowledge that had been lost? What if the pre-flood kings of the king list represented a previous civilization, one that had developed over those impossible spans of time, only to be destroyed in a cataclysm so complete that only fragments remained? When we examine the king list more closely, patterns begin to emerge. The 8 antediluvian kings did not all rule for the same length of time, but their reigns follow specific mathematical ratios. Alulim's 28,800 years, Alalgar's 36,000, Enmenluana's 43,200. These are not random numbers. They are multiples of 3,600, a number that held special significance in Sumerian cosmology. The Sumerians called this unit a Shah, and they used it to measure vast cosmic cycles. 10 Shah for one king, 12 Shah for another, the mathematics of eternity encoded in clay. Some researchers have suggested that these numbers represent something other than literal years. Perhaps they are counting lunar months or seasons or some other unit of time that would reduce the reigns to more manageable lengths. But even when divided by 12 to convert years to months, the reigns remain impossibly long, spanning thousands of years rather than tens of thousands. No matter how we manipulate the numbers, we cannot make them fit into a normal human timeline. Others have proposed that the long reigns represent periods of cultural stability, eras rather than individual rulers. In this interpretation, Alulim represents not a single king, but the entire period of early Sumerian civilization, before the rise of competing city-states. This theory has some appeal, but it does not explain why the Sumerians would have framed these eras as individual rulers, giving them names and specific reign lengths. If they had wanted to describe historical periods, they had the linguistic and mathematical tools to do so directly. Perhaps the most intriguing interpretation comes from scholars who study Sumerian astronomy. The number 241,200, the total span of the antediluvian reigns, corresponds almost exactly to certain astronomical cycles known to ancient astronomers. Specifically, it is close to the length of time required for the Earth's axis to complete a full cycle of precession, the slow wobble of the planet's rotation that causes the position of the stars to shift over millennia. Could the 8 kings represent 8 complete precessional cycles? Could the king list be encoding astronomical knowledge in the form of a king list? This interpretation has a certain elegance, but it raises as many questions as it answers. If the Sumerians possessed such advanced astronomical knowledge, where did they get it? Tracking precession requires careful observation over many centuries, if not millennia. Who was doing this observing before the Sumerians? And why would they encode this knowledge in such an obscure form? There is another possibility, one that most mainstream scholars refuse to consider, but that haunts the margins of archaeological discourse. What if the numbers are real? What if the 8 antediluvian kings actually ruled for those impossible spans of time? not as human beings with normal lifespans, but as something else, something that lived on a different time scale, that experienced time differently than we do. The Sumerians did not consider their pre-flood kings to be fully human. In their mythology, these early rulers walked with the gods, perhaps were themselves semi-divine. They belonged to an age when the boundary between heaven and earth was more permeable, when beings from above moved freely among those below. Could the king list be preserving a memory of contact with non-human intelligence? With beings whose lifespans or whose perception of time differed radically from our own? This interpretation ventures into territory that makes academic historians deeply uncomfortable. It smacks of ancient astronaut theories and pseudo-archaeology. Yet we must ask, why did the Sumerians go to such lengths to preserve these records? Why did they copy and recopied the king list for over 1,000 years, maintaining its impossible chronology even as their own society evolved and changed? Why did they carve these numbers into stone, meant to last forever? The Sumerians were practical people. They invented writing not to record myths and legends, but to keep track of grain shipments and tax payments. When they recorded something, it was because they believed it mattered. The king list mattered enough to be copied dozens of times, to be preserved in multiple cities, to be maintained even as dynasties rose and fell. This was not a curiosity or a piece of creative fiction. This was a document that the Sumerians considered essential to their understanding of who they were and where they came from. And then there is the flood. The king list states clearly that after 241,200 years of rule by the 8 antediluvian kings, the flood swept over. This is not presented as myth or metaphor. It is stated as historical fact, the great dividing line of Sumerian history. Everything that came before the flood was different, impossible, divine. Everything after the flood was human, measurable, real. But crucially, the flood did not erase the memory of what came before. The Sumerians remembered. They remembered the names of the ancient kings. They remembered how long each one had ruled. They remembered that there had been a world before this one, a world so different that its timeline defies our comprehension. The flood story is not unique to Sumer. It appears in virtually every ancient culture around the world, from the biblical account of Noah to the Greek legend of Deucalion, from the Hindu story of Manu to the Native American tales of world-ending deluges. This universality suggests that the flood, or something like it, was a real event, a cataclysm so devastating that it left its mark on the collective memory of humanity. Geological evidence supports the existence of catastrophic flooding in the ancient Near East. Excavations at Ur, Uruk, and other Sumerian cities have revealed distinct layers of river sediment, meters thick, separating earlier settlement levels from later ones. These flood layers date to approximately 2900 BCE, around the time that Sumerian civilization was beginning to flourish. Below these layers, archaeologists have found evidence of older cultures, settlements that existed before the flood and were buried by it. But these pre-flood settlements are not Sumerian. They belong to what archaeologists call the Ubaid culture, a mysterious people who inhabited Mesopotamia before the Sumerians arrived. The Ubaid left behind pottery, tools, and the foundations of temples, but no writing. We do not know what language they spoke or what they called themselves. They are a people without a name, buried beneath the flood layer, forgotten by history. Could the Ubaid have been the civilization remembered in the king list? Could the 8 antediluvian kings have been Ubaid rulers, their reigns distorted by the passage of time and the trauma of the flood into impossibly long spans? This theory has some appeal, but it does not fully explain the king list's chronology. Even if we assume that the pre-flood section is a highly compressed account of Ubaid civilization, the numbers remain far too large to represent any known historical period. The Ubaid culture lasted roughly 2,000 years, not 240,000. Something else is being encoded in these numbers, some other kind of time, some other way of measuring duration that we have lost the ability to understand. Perhaps the key to unlocking the king list lies not in trying to make its numbers fit our timeline, but in accepting that it is describing a different kind of time altogether. A time before time as we know it, when the world operated according to different rules, when beings that we can barely imagine walked the earth and ruled over the first cities. The Sumerians called this time before time the first times, an age when gods and humans mingled freely, when the secrets of civilization were first revealed. They looked back on this era with a mixture of reverence and sorrow, knowing that something profound had been lost when the flood swept over. Kingship had ascended back to heaven, and humanity was left to rebuild on its own, guided only by fragmented memories of what had been. This brings us to the central mystery of the king list. It is not simply a record of rulers. It is a record of loss, a document that mourns the passing of an age when humanity was connected to something greater than itself. The impossible numbers are not meant to be calculated or explained away. They are meant to evoke awe, to remind us that there was once a time so different from our own that its very duration defies comprehension. Before we continue deeper into this mystery, pause for a moment. Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing in the ruins of ancient Eridu, the first city where kingship first descended from heaven. The sun beats down on crumbled mud brick walls. The wind whispers through empty doorways. Beneath your feet lie layer upon layer of history, each generation building on top of the last, each city rising from the ruins of the one before. And far below, deeper than archaeologists have yet dug, lie the foundations of something older still, something that remembers the time before the flood. When archaeologists excavated Eridu in the 1940s, they discovered something extraordinary. The site contained not one temple but 20 temples, each built directly on top of the previous one. The earliest of these temples dated to around 5,400 BCE, making it one of the oldest religious structures ever found. But what struck the excavators was the consistency of the design. Each temple, no matter how old, followed the same basic layout, oriented in the same direction, dedicated to the same god. It was as if the builders were following a blueprint that never changed, a sacred pattern that had been established at the very beginning and maintained for thousands of years. This temple was dedicated to Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom, fresh water, and the cosmic abyss. According to Sumerian mythology, Enki was the god who brought civilization to humanity, who taught them writing and mathematics and agriculture. He dwelt in the Abzu, the primordial ocean beneath the earth, where he stored the Mi, the divine principles of civilization. The temple at Eridu was his house on earth, the place where the boundary between the divine and human worlds was thinnest. But beneath the earliest temple level, the archaeologists found something even older, pottery shards and tools that predated the Sumerian era, artifacts from the Ubaid culture that had inhabited Mesopotamia before the Sumerians arrived. And beneath that, still older layers, settlement after settlement extending back into prehistory, each one building on the same spot, as if this particular location held some special significance that transcended culture and time. The Sumerians did not choose Eridu randomly. They built there because it had always been a sacred place, because people had been building there since time immemorial, because it was, in some fundamental sense, the first place. When the king list states that kingship first descended in Eridu, it is making a claim about the origin not just of Sumerian civilization, but of civilization itself. Eridu was where it all began, where humanity first organized itself into cities, first developed writing and law and religion. Everything that followed, all the great civilizations of history, Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Greece, Rome, all of them trace their ancestry back to this one place, this mound of dirt in the desert of southern Iraq. But the king list adds a troubling detail. When kingship descended in Eridu, the first king was Alulim, who ruled for 28,800 years. If we take this statement at face value, it means that the beginning of civilization dates back not 6,000 years as conventional archaeology suggests, but 28,000 years or more. It means that everything we think we know about the rise of human civilization is wrong, that we are missing vast stretches of time, entire epochs that have been erased from history or buried so deep that we have not yet found them. Could this be true? Could there have been a civilization in Mesopotamia 28,000 years ago? Standard archaeological thinking says no. 28,000 years ago was the height of the last ice age. Modern humans existed, but they were hunter-gatherers, living in small nomadic bands, nowhere near developing cities or writing or any of the other hallmarks of civilization. And yet, increasingly, that standard narrative is being challenged. In recent decades, archaeologists have discovered evidence of complex societies existing far earlier than previously thought. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive temple complex dated to 9,600 BCE, was built by people who supposedly had not yet invented agriculture. The site predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years and the Sumerian cities by 5,000 years, yet it displays sophisticated architectural knowledge and artistic skill. Who built it? How did they organize the labor? What kind of society were they part of? Göbekli Tepe forces us to reconsider the timeline of human development. If people were building monumental architecture 11,000 years ago, what else might they have been doing? What other achievements might be buried beneath the layers of time, waiting to be discovered? And if there was advanced human activity in the Near East 11,000 years ago, why not 28,000 years ago? Or even longer? The objection, of course, is that we have no evidence for such ancient civilizations. If they existed, where are their cities, their writings, their tools? The answer may lie in what happened at the end of the last ice age. Around 12,000 years ago, the great ice sheets that covered much of the northern hemisphere began to melt. As they melted, sea levels rose dramatically, more than 120 meters in some places. Coastlines that had been dry land for millennia were suddenly submerged beneath hundreds of feet of water. If there were civilizations living along these ancient coastlines, and coastlines are where civilizations naturally develop, they would have been completely destroyed, their cities drowned, their people scattered, or killed, any evidence of their existence would now lie beneath the ocean, buried under sediment, effectively erased from the archaeological record. This is not wild speculation. Underwater archaeology has begun to reveal submerged landscapes and structures that hint at human habitation in areas that are now far offshore, off the coast of India, off Japan, in the Mediterranean, in the Persian Gulf. Divers and sonar have detected what appear to be man-made structures beneath the waves. These discoveries are controversial and difficult to verify, but they suggest that the map of human civilization is incomplete, that there are chapters of our history that were quite literally washed away. The flood that the Sumerians remembered may have been part of this great post-glacial inundation. As the ice melted and seas rose, the Persian Gulf, which during the Ice Age had been dry land, filled with water. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which now empty into the Gulf, would have flowed through this region when it was still above sea level. People living in this area would have experienced a gradual but inexorable flooding as the waters rose year after year, generation after generation, swallowing their farms and villages, forcing them to retreat ever higher. By the time the flooding stopped, the landscape would have been completely transformed. An entire region, perhaps the cradle of an ancient civilization, buried beneath the waves. Could this be what the king list is remembering? Could the antediluvian kings have ruled in a civilization that existed in what is now the Persian Gulf, in a land that was swallowed by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age? If so, the 241,200 years of their combined reigns might represent not the duration of individual lives, but the span of time that this lost civilization endured, distorted by oral tradition into the reigns of 8 legendary kings. This interpretation would make the king list not a literal historical record, but a compressed and mythologized memory of a real historical process, the slow drowning of an ancient world. It would explain why the Sumerians placed such emphasis on the flood as a dividing line in history. It was not a single catastrophic event, but a long, drawn-out disaster that fundamentally reshaped their world and severed them from their past. Everything before the flood was foreign, almost incomprehensible, a time so different that it could only be described in mythological terms. Everything after the flood was familiar, the world as they knew it. But this interpretation, while plausible, still does not fully account for the specific numbers in the king list. Why 28,800 years for Alulim? Why 36,000 for Alalgar? If these numbers are simply meant to convey great antiquity, why not use round numbers like 10,000 or 100,000? Why these specific multiples of 3,600? The answer may lie in Sumerian astronomy and mathematics. The Sumerians were obsessive sky watchers. They mapped the movements of the planets and stars with remarkable precision, tracking cycles that repeated over years, decades, and centuries. They developed a sophisticated mathematical system based on the number 60, which allowed them to make complex calculations and to divide circles into degrees and time into hours and minutes, a system we still use today. They understood that the heavens operated according to regular, predictable patterns, and they believed that these celestial cycles were connected to events on Earth, that what happened above influenced what happened below. One of the most important celestial cycles known to ancient astronomers was the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to shift over time. A complete precessional cycle takes approximately 25,920 years. A period sometimes called the Great Year or the Platonic Year. The Sumerians may not have had the modern understanding of what causes precession, but they almost certainly observed its effects. The gradual shift of the constellations against the horizon, the way certain stars that once rose at the spring equinox no longer did so. If the Sumerians were encoding precessional cycles in the king list, the 8 antediluvian kings might represent 8 great epochs, each corresponding to a major shift in the celestial order. Alulim's 28,800 years would be slightly more than one complete precessional cycle. The total of 241,200 years would be roughly 9 complete cycles. These are not arbitrary numbers. They are astronomical constants, the rhythms of the cosmos encoded in the reigns of mythical kings. This astronomical interpretation suggests that the king list is not history in the conventional sense, but rather a kind of cosmic calendar, a way of marking the passage of vast epochs defined by the movements of the heavens. The 8 kings are not individuals, but personifications of ages, each one representing a different configuration of the night sky, a different orientation of Earth relative to the stars. When the flood swept over, it marked not just a geological catastrophe, but a cosmic transition, the end of one great cycle and the beginning of another. This would explain why the Sumerians treated the king list with such reverence. It was not merely a list of rulers, but a sacred text, a key to understanding humanity's place in the grand cycles of time. It connected their own small lives to the vast rhythms of the universe, reminding them that they were part of something much larger and more enduring than any individual or even any civilization. But even this explanation leaves us with a nagging sense of incompleteness. If the king list is an astronomical text, why frame it as a king list? Why not simply record the celestial cycles directly? The Sumerians had the mathematical and linguistic tools to do so. They kept detailed astronomical diaries, recording the positions of planets and the dates of eclipses. If they wanted to preserve knowledge of precessional cycles, they could have done so explicitly, unless, of course, they had a reason to encode this knowledge in mythological form. Unless there was something about the pre-flood age that could not be spoken of directly, something that had to be concealed within the structure of a king list. Esoteric traditions from many ancient cultures speak of secret knowledge, wisdom that was considered too dangerous or too sacred to be shared openly. This knowledge was encoded in myths, symbols, and numbers, hidden in plain sight so that only the initiated could understand it. Could the king list be such an encoded text? Could the 8 antediluvian kings and their impossible reigns be a cipher, a way of preserving information about the deep past while concealing it from those who are not ready to understand? If so, what is being concealed? What truth about the pre-flood world was so important that it needed to be preserved, yet so dangerous that it could not be stated plainly? Perhaps the answer lies in the nature of kingship itself. The Sumerians did not view kingship as a human institution that developed naturally over time. They believed that kingship descended from heaven, that it was a gift from the gods, a principle of cosmic order imposed upon the human world. Without kingship, there could be no civilization, no justice, no prosperity. The world would descend into chaos. But where did kingship come from originally? Who or what first established this principle? The king list suggests that it came from the antediluvian kings, those 8 mysterious rulers who governed in the time before the flood. They were the ones who first embodied the principle of kingship, who first channeled divine authority into human form. After the flood swept over, kingship ascended back to heaven, withdrawing from the world. But then it descended again, this time in the city of Kish, and human rulers once more took up the mantle of divine authority. The pattern is clear. Kingship is not permanent. It can be withdrawn and restored. It moves in cycles, just like the celestial bodies that the Sumerians observed so carefully. And if kingship can be withdrawn and restored, then so can civilization itself. The flood was not just a natural disaster. It was a cosmic reset, a moment when the old order was swept away and a new order had to be established. The antediluvian kings represented the first order, the original template of civilization. The post-flood kings represented a restoration, an attempt to rebuild what had been lost. But it was not a perfect restoration. The post-flood world was diminished, fallen. The kings no longer ruled for tens of thousands of years. Their connection to the divine had weakened. Humanity had to make do with fragmentary memories and partial knowledge. This cyclical view of history is deeply alien to the modern Western mind. We have been taught to think of history as progress, a steady march from primitive beginnings to advanced modernity. But the Sumerians, like many ancient peoples, saw history as a cycle of golden ages and dark ages, of rises and falls. They knew that civilizations do not last forever, that even the mightiest empires eventually crumble into dust. They had seen it happen, perhaps multiple times. Their own civilization was built on the ruins of earlier ones, and they knew that someday future civilizations would build on their ruins in turn. This cyclical understanding of time gives the king list a different significance. It is not trying to provide a linear chronology of events. It is trying to convey the pattern, the rhythm of how civilizations rise and fall, how knowledge is gained and lost, how humanity is connected to cosmic cycles that dwarf individual lives and even entire historical epochs. The 8 antediluvian kings are not meant to be understood as biographical figures. They are meant to be understood as archetypes, as embodiments of principles that transcend individual human existence. In this light, the question of whether the king list is historically accurate becomes almost irrelevant. What matters is not whether Alulim actually ruled for 28,800 years, but what that statement means, what truth it is trying to convey about the nature of time, civilization, and humanity's relationship to the divine. The Sumerians were telling us something profound about the human condition, that we are creatures who exist between two poles, the divine and the earthly, the eternal and the temporal. We come from something greater than ourselves, something that the antediluvian kings represent, and we are always trying to return to it, to recover the knowledge and the connection that was lost when the flood swept over. Every civilization is an attempt at restoration, an effort to rebuild the Golden Age, and every civilization eventually fails, swept away by its own flood, whether literal or metaphorical. But the pattern endures. Kingship descends, kingship ascends, kingship descends again. The cycle continues, eternal and inevitable. The flood itself deserves closer examination, for it is the pivot point of the entire king list, the moment when everything changes. Before the flood, 8 kings ruling for impossible spans of time. After the flood, normal human history. The flood is the boundary between 2 different kinds of existence, 2 different modes of being. What exactly was this flood? The biblical account in Genesis describes a global deluge that covered the entire earth, destroying all life except for Noah, his family, and the animals on the ark. The Sumerian version, found in various texts including the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Eridu Genesis, tells a similar story but with different details. The gods, disturbed by the noise and wickedness of humanity, decide to send a flood to wipe out humankind. But Enki, the god of wisdom, takes pity on Ziusudra, a righteous king, and warns him to build a boat. Ziusudra survives the flood along with his family and various animals, and after the waters recede, he offers sacrifices to the gods, who grant him immortality. The parallels between the Sumerian and biblical flood stories are striking and have led many scholars to conclude that they derive from a common source, a memory of an actual catastrophic flood that devastated Mesopotamia in ancient times. Archaeological evidence supports the occurrence of major flooding in the region. Excavations at multiple Sumerian sites, including Ur, Uruk, Shuruppak, and Kish, have revealed distinct layers of water-deposited sediment separating older settlement levels from newer ones. These flood layers vary in thickness from a few centimeters to several meters, and they date to different periods, suggesting that the region experienced multiple catastrophic floods over the course of its history. The most extensive flood layer, found at Shuruppak, dates to approximately 2900 BCE, right around the time that Sumerian civilization was emerging from its prehistoric phase. This flood layer is overlaid by a new settlement with distinctly Sumerian characteristics, suggesting that there was indeed a major discontinuity in the region's history, a break between what came before and what came after. But was this local flood in Mesopotamia the same flood remembered in the king list? Or was the king list preserving the memory of something even older and more catastrophic, the great post-glacial flooding that occurred at the end of the last ice age? The geological evidence for dramatic sea level rise during the Holocene, the current geological epoch which began around 11,700 years ago, is overwhelming. As the Ice Age glaciers melted, sea levels rose by more than 120 meters, redrawing the map of the world. Coastlines retreated, islands vanished, land bridges were submerged. The process was not uniform. It happened in pulses, with periods of rapid rise, followed by periods of relative stability. One of the most dramatic pulses occurred around 8,200 years ago, when the sudden draining of glacial Lake Agassiz in North America caused sea levels to jump by several meters in a short period. Another pulse occurred even earlier, around 14,500 years ago, associated with something called Meltwater Pulse 1A, when sea levels rose by 16 to 25 meters in less than 500 years. For people living in coastal regions during these periods, the effect would have been catastrophic. The sea would have advanced inland year after year, decade after decade, swallowing everything in its path. Communities would have been forced to retreat again and again, abandoning their homes and fields, watching their ancestral lands disappear beneath the waves. If there were advanced societies existing during this period, which the existence of sites like Göbekli Tepe suggests there may have been, they would have been devastated by this flooding. Their settlements, if located on the coasts or in low-lying river valleys, would now be underwater. Any evidence of their existence would be buried beneath meters of marine sediment. We would have no direct knowledge of them unless we went looking in the right places with underwater archaeology. This raises a tantalizing possibility. What if the antediluvian kings of the Sumerian king list represent not individual rulers of Sumer, but a dimly remembered lineage of leaders from a pre-flood civilization, a society that existed on the lands that are now submerged beneath the Persian Gulf? What if the 241,200 years of their combined reigns is a distorted echo of how long that civilization lasted, compressed through oral tradition into the reigns of 8 mythical kings? What if the flood that swept over was not the relatively minor Mesopotamian flood of 2900 BCE, but the great post-glacial inundation that reshaped the world? This interpretation would explain several puzzling features of the king list. It would explain why the pre-flood kings are so different from the post-flood kings, because they belonged to a fundamentally different culture, one that was separated from the Sumerians by thousands of years, and an apocalyptic flood. It would explain why the Sumerians themselves seem to regard the antediluvian period as foreign and mythological, because they were preserving memories of a time so ancient that it had become legendary. And it would explain why similar flood myths appear in cultures all around the world, because the post-glacial flooding was a global phenomenon that affected coastlines everywhere. Every ancient coastal civilization would have experienced it, and every one would have preserved memories of it in myth and legend. But this interpretation also raises profound questions. If the king list is preserving memories of a pre-flood civilization, what was that civilization like? How advanced was it? What happened to its people? Did any of them survive to pass on their knowledge to later generations? And if so, might that explain the sudden appearance of advanced civilization in Sumer and perhaps in Egypt and other regions as well? The idea that civilization did not develop independently in various regions, but was instead seeded by survivors of an earlier global civilization, is an old and controversial one. It appears in the writings of Plato, who described Atlantis as an advanced island civilization that was destroyed by a cataclysm. It appears in the mythologies of many indigenous cultures which speak of bearded strangers who came from across the sea after a great disaster and taught the ancestors agriculture, astronomy, and architecture. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, this idea was developed into elaborate theories about lost continents and ancient super-civilizations, most of which have been thoroughly debunked. But the core intuition behind these theories remains intriguing. The sudden appearance of advanced civilization in multiple regions around the world, often at roughly the same time, prehistorically speaking, is strange. Why did agriculture develop independently in at least 7 different regions within a few thousand years, after millions of years of human existence without agriculture? Why do pyramids appear in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mexico, and Peru, built by cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other? Mainstream archaeology explains these parallel developments as the result of similar environmental pressures and similar human ingenuity. Humans in different parts of the world independently figuring out similar solutions to similar problems. And that explanation is certainly plausible for many things, but it does not fully account for some of the more specific similarities. The shared mythological motifs, the similar architectural techniques, the common symbol systems. At the very least, it seems clear that there was more contact between ancient cultures than we have traditionally assumed. Trade networks, cultural exchanges, and the movement of people and ideas over vast distances may have been far more extensive in the ancient world than our fragmented archaeological record suggests. And if there were such networks, they could have facilitated the spread of knowledge from older civilizations to newer ones, creating the impression of sudden advancement where in fact there was cultural transmission. But transmission from where? From whom? If we push this line of reasoning to its logical conclusion, we are led back to the possibility of a source civilization, an original culture that developed advanced knowledge and then spread it, either through direct contact or through the survival of a priestly or scholarly class that preserved and transmitted that knowledge after their own civilization collapsed. Could the antediluvian kings have been the rulers of such a source civilization? Could the Sumerians have been the inheritors of their knowledge, the ones who preserved and built upon what the pre-flood civilization had achieved? The Sumerians themselves seemed to believe something like this. Their myths consistently describe civilization as something that was given to them by the gods, not something they invented on their own. The god Enki brought the the principles of civilization from the Abzu, the cosmic ocean beneath the earth. The Apkallu, the 7 sages who were Enki's servants, rose from the sea to teach humanity before the flood. These myths can be read as allegorical descriptions of cultural transmission, knowledge passing from an earlier culture, associated with water and the sea, to the Sumerians. If we accept this reading, the antediluvian kings cease to be mythological figures and become instead symbols of a real historical process, the preservation and transmission of knowledge across a catastrophic break in continuity. The flood destroyed the physical civilization that had created that knowledge, but the knowledge itself survived in the memories of those who came after, encoded in myths and king lists and the structures of temples. This brings us to one of the most fascinating and least understood aspects of Sumerian civilization, the sudden appearance of complex writing. The earliest Sumerian texts date to around 3200 BCE and already display a sophisticated writing system with hundreds of signs representing both syllables and whole words. There is no evidence of a gradual development of this writing system, no earlier, simpler forms that we can point to as precursors. Writing appears in Sumer fully formed, as if it had been invented all at once. This is deeply puzzling. Writing is one of the most complex technologies ever developed. It requires not just the invention of a set of symbols, but also the development of grammatical rules, standardized spellings, a trained class of scribes, and a social structure that values record keeping. All of these things take time to develop, yet in Sumer they appear to have emerged within a single generation or two. The conventional explanation is that the earlier stages of writing development were done on perishable materials like wood or leather, which have not survived, and that we are seeing only the end product once the technology was transferred to durable clay tablets. This is possible, but it is also suspiciously convenient. An alternative explanation is that writing, like other aspects of Sumerian civilization, was not invented in Sumer, but inherited from an earlier source. If an advanced pre-flood civilization had developed writing, and if survivors of that civilization passed on their knowledge to the post-flood world, it would explain why writing appears so suddenly in Sumer. It would also explain certain peculiarities of the cuneiform writing system, such as the fact that many signs seem to be derived from earlier pictographic forms that no longer have clear meanings, as if the Sumerians were copying symbols whose original significance had been lost. This pattern of inheriting and imperfectly understanding a legacy from the past is visible throughout Sumerian culture. Their temples, for instance, are built on raised platforms, a design feature whose purpose is not entirely clear, but which the Sumerians maintained across thousands of years, building new temples on top of old ones using the same basic plan. It is as if they were following a blueprint handed down from antiquity, preserving a sacred pattern even if they no longer fully understood its original meaning. Their mathematical system, based on the number 60, is extraordinarily sophisticated and perfect for astronomical calculations, but its origins are obscure. Why base a number system on 60 rather than 10? The Sumerians must have had a reason, but that reason is lost to us. Perhaps it was a convention inherited from an earlier culture that had different priorities than the Sumerians themselves. Even their language, Sumerian, is an enigma. It is a language isolate, unrelated to any other known language family. Where did it come from? Who spoke it before the Sumerians? The conventional answer is that the Sumerians brought their language with them when they migrated into Mesopotamia from somewhere else, but we have no idea where that somewhere else might be. Every attempt to connect Sumerian to other language families has failed. It stands alone, an orphan language with no known relatives, unless, of course, its relatives were lost when the flood swept over. If Sumerian was one of several related languages spoken by pre-flood cultures, and if those other cultures were destroyed or displaced by the flooding, Sumerian might be the sole survivor of an otherwise extinct language family. The king list in this interpretation takes on new significance. It is not just a list of mythical rulers, but a linguistic fossil, one of the few texts that preserves names and possibly words from the pre-flood era. The names of the antediluvian kings, Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, are unlike later Sumerian names. They have an archaic quality, a strangeness that sets them apart. They may be relics of an older form of Sumerian or even of a predecessor language preserved through oral tradition and finally written down when the Sumerians developed writing. Archaeology can only take us so far in answering these questions. The physical remains of ancient civilizations are fragmentary and prone to misinterpretation. We can excavate buildings and artifacts, but we cannot excavate ideas or memories. The true inheritance of the pre-flood world, if such a world existed, would not be found in the ground. It would be found in the myths, the symbols, the mathematical mathematical systems, the architectural plans, the very structure of civilization itself. These are the things that survive cataclysms, carried forward by people who preserve them even when they no longer fully understand them. The Sumerian king list is one such survival, a message passed down across unimaginable spans of time, encoded in the reigns of 8 mythical kings. Whether those kings ever existed as real individuals is almost beside the point. What matters is that the Sumerians believed they existed, that they preserved their memory for thousands of years, copying and recopying the king list generation after generation, maintaining its impossible chronology even as their own world changed around them. They were trying to tell us something, and we have been too quick to dismiss their message as myth or exaggeration. Perhaps it is time to listen more carefully, to take seriously the possibility that the king list contains truth, even if that truth is not literal historical fact. Perhaps the antediluvian kings represent something real, a lost chapter of human history that was erased by the greatest catastrophe our species has ever endured. The flood that swept over did not just destroy cities and kill people. It destroyed memory, severed the connection between the past and the future, forced humanity to start over with only fragments of the old knowledge to guide them. The Sumerians, standing at the dawn of recorded history, looking back into the abyss of time, saw those fragments and tried to preserve them. They encoded them in their king list, in their myths, in the very foundations of their civilization. And now, thousands of years later, we stand at another threshold with tools and knowledge that the Sumerians could never have imagined, and we are finally beginning to piece together the story they were trying to tell. The clay tablets speak if we are willing to listen. The numbers whisper their secrets if we are patient enough to decode them, and the ancient kings, impossible and mythical as they may seem, point us toward a truth that is both humbling and awe-inspiring. Human civilization is older and more complex than we have been taught. The timeline we have constructed is incomplete, missing vast chapters that were lost when the flood swept over. And somewhere, beneath the waves or beneath the sands or buried so deep that we have not yet found them, lie the ruins of the first cities, the libraries of the first scribes, the temples of the first kings. They are waiting to be discovered, waiting to reveal the truth about where we came from and who we were before the world as we know it began. Before we continue, take a moment to breathe deeply. Let the weight of these vast time scales settle upon you. 241,200 years. It is a number that exceeds human comprehension, that mocks our brief lives and our brief civilizations. And yet the Sumerians wrote it down and preserved it, as if to say, there is more to our story than you know, more time behind us than you can imagine. And the truth of it is written in numbers that refuse to be forgotten. The antediluvian kings, the 8 rulers before the flood, are more than names on a clay tablet. They are signposts pointing toward a forgotten world, a civilization that existed beyond the reach of our archaeology, beyond the limits of our current understanding. Each king represents not just an individual, but an epoch, a vast span of time when the world was different, when humanity was different, when the relationship between the earthly and the divine was not yet broken. Let us look more closely at these 8 kings, at what little we know of them and what their names and numbers might reveal. Alulim of Eridu is the first king on the list, the one who ruled for 28,800 years. His name appears nowhere else in Sumerian literature. There are no myths about him, no hymns, no temples dedicated to him. He exists only in the king list, a single entry marking the beginning of kingship on Earth. The name Alulim may derive from Sumerian roots meaning stag or ram, animals associated with leadership and fertility. Or it may be a name so ancient that its meaning was already lost by the time the Sumerians wrote it down. What is clear is that Alulim represents the very first king, the template from which all other kings derive. He is kingship in its purest, most essential form, unencumbered by history or personality. His city, Eridu, was, according to Sumerian tradition, the oldest city in the world, the place where civilization began. Archaeological excavations have confirmed that Eridu was indeed one of the earliest permanent settlements in Mesopotamia, with occupation levels dating back to 5400 BCE or earlier. But the king list claims that Alulim ruled Eridu for 28,800 years, which would push the founding of the city back to around 30,000 BCE, deep into the last ice age, long before agriculture or sedentary life supposedly existed. This is impossible according to conventional archaeology, and yet the number 28,800 is not arbitrary. It is exactly 8 times 3,600 shars in Sumerian reckoning. 8 is a significant number in Sumerian cosmology, associated with completion and cosmic order. The goddess Inanna descended through 8 gates to reach the underworld. There were 8 winds that determined the weather. The use of 8 in connection with Alulim suggests that his reign represented a complete cosmic cycle, an entire age of the world, from beginning to end. If we interpret 28,800 years not as literal years, but as a symbolic representation of a complete precessional cycle, roughly 26,000 years, then Alulim's reign would represent the time it takes for the Earth's axis to complete one full wobble, for the pole to trace a complete circle against the background of stars. During such a period, the entire sky would gradually shift, with different stars serving as the North Star, different constellations rising at the equinoxes. For a culture that watched the heavens as closely as the Sumerians did, such changes would be momentous, marking cosmic transitions from one age to another. Alulim, then, might be understood as the personification of the first great age, the first cycle of the heavens, the beginning of time as the Sumerians measured it. After Alulim came Alalgar, also of Eridu, who ruled for 36,000 years or 10 shars. Again, the number is suspiciously neat, a perfect multiple of the base unit. Alalgar's name may mean father or cultivator, though, like Alulim, he appears nowhere else in Sumerian texts. His 36,000-year reign is even longer than Alulim's, representing an age of even greater duration, or perhaps one measured according to different celestial cycles. Together, Alulim and Alalgar ruled Eridu for 64,800 years before kingship moved to another city. The third king on the list is Enmenluana of Badtibera, who ruled for 43,200 years or 12 shars. This is the longest reign in the entire king list, and it marks a transition. Kingship has moved from Eridu to Badtibera, from the first city to the second, from the city of Enki to the city of Dumuzi. Badtibera was associated with metalworking and craftsmanship, the place where the arts of civilization were refined and developed. Enmenluana's name incorporates the element En, which in Sumerian signifies a lord or priest, and Luana, which may refer to luster or light. He was the Lord of Light, the one who illuminated the age in which he ruled. His extraordinarily long reign suggests a time of stability and cultural achievement, an age when the arts and sciences flourished under benevolent rule. The fourth king is Enmen-Galana, also of Bad Tibira, who ruled for 28,800 years, the same length as Alulim's reign. The repetition of this specific number suggests a pattern, a rhythm in the cycles of kingship. Enmen-Galana's name means Great En or Lord of Greatness, marking him as a figure of supreme authority. Together with Enmen-Luana, he presided over Bad Tibira for 72,000 years, a vast epoch that saw the development of metallurgy, agriculture, and the other foundations of civilized life. The fifth king is Dumuzi of Bad Tibira, who ruled for 36,000 years. Unlike the previous kings, Dumuzi is a name that appears extensively in later Sumerian mythology. He is the shepherd god, the consort of the goddess Inanna, whose death and descent to the underworld was mourned annually in Sumerian ritual. The inclusion of Dumuzi in the king list creates a bridge between the mythological and the historical, suggesting that the antediluvian kings were not entirely separate from the gods worshipped in historical times, but rather earlier manifestations of the same divine principles. Dumuzi's role as a shepherd is significant. Shepherding, the management of flocks, is one of the earliest and most important economic activities of civilized society. By including a shepherd among the antediluvian kings, the king list acknowledges the pastoral origins of Sumerian culture, the deep connection between civilization and the domestication of animals. After Dumuzi, kingship moved to Larak, where the sixth king, Ensipaziana, ruled for 28,800 years. His name may mean Lord of the Radiant Crown, suggesting a ruler of great power and divine authority. Larak was apparently a small city, and little is known about it from archaeology, but its inclusion in the king list indicates that it once held importance in the antediluvian world. The seventh king was Enmendarana of Sippar, who ruled for 21,000 years. This is a slightly shorter reign than the others, though still impossibly long by human standards. Sippar was the city of the sun god Utu, and Enmendarana's name suggests a connection to cosmic order and duration. Sippar would later become an important center of astronomical observation and record-keeping, and it is possible that this association with celestial knowledge dates back to the antediluvian period, at least in mythological terms. There is something fascinating about Enmendarana specifically. In later Babylonian tradition, he was associated with the seventh of the Apkallu, the seven sages who came from the sea to teach humanity. His name contains the element dur, meaning to last or to endure, suggesting that he was the king who preserved knowledge across the boundary of the flood. Some scholars have even suggested that Enmendarana corresponds to the biblical Enoch, who walked with God and was taken up to heaven without dying. Both figures are seventh in their respective genealogies. Both are associated with secret knowledge and divine mysteries. Both are connected to the preservation of wisdom across cataclysmic boundaries. The eighth and final antediluvian king was Ubara Tutu of Shuruppak, who ruled for 18,600 years. Ubara Tutu is significant because he is identified in some texts as the father of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah who built the ark and survived the flood. This connection places the flood narrative directly within the chronology of the king list, making it clear that the flood marked the end of Ubara Tutu's reign and the end of the antediluvian age. Shurapak, Ubaratutu's city, is also significant. It is one of the cities where archaeologists have found clear evidence of catastrophic flooding, with a distinct layer of water-deposited sediment separating earlier settlement levels from later ones. The flood, remembered in myth, has a geological correlate, a real event that destroyed cities and disrupted civilizations. The name Ubaratutu itself is interesting. It may mean friend of the god, suggesting a ruler who maintained the connection between heaven and earth even as the antediluvian age was drawing to its close. That his son would be the one chosen to survive the flood suggests that this family line was considered special, worthy of preservation, carriers of knowledge that must not be allowed to die. When we add up the reigns of these 8 kings, we get 241,200 years, a number that has puzzled and fascinated scholars for over a century. What does it mean? If we take it literally, it places the beginning of kingship in approximately 243,000 BCE, a date so remote that modern humans had not even evolved yet. Homo sapiens as a species is only about 300,000 years old, and anatomically modern humans with full cognitive capabilities have only existed for perhaps 100,000 years. The idea that there were cities and kings 241,000 years ago is absurd from a scientific standpoint, and yet the Sumerians recorded it with the same care and precision that they used for all their other records. They were not writing fiction or allegory, they were recording what they believed to be the truth. One way to interpret this number is to assume that the Sumerians were using a different unit of time than literal solar years. Perhaps they were counting lunar months, which would reduce 241,200 years to about 20,000 years. Still very ancient, but at least within the time frame of anatomically modern humans. Or perhaps they were counting seasons, which would reduce the number even further. But the problem with these reductions is that they are arbitrary. There is no evidence that the Sumerians used anything other than solar years for their chronology. When they recorded the reigns of historical kings, those reigns are measured in years, and they correspond reasonably well to what we know from other sources. Another interpretation is that the numbers are not meant to be taken literally at all, but rather symbolically. The 8 kings represent 8 ages or cycles, and the specific numbers of years assigned to each are not historical durations, but rather code numbers that encode astronomical or mathematical knowledge. The frequent use of multiples of 3,600, the Shah, supports this interpretation. The Sumerians may have been using the king list as a mnemonic device, a way of preserving complex numerical information in narrative form. If this is correct, then decoding the king list requires understanding the astronomical and mathematical principles that the Sumerians were encoding, a task made difficult by the gaps in our knowledge of Sumerian science. A third interpretation, and perhaps the most provocative, is that the numbers represent something we do not yet understand about the nature of time itself. Modern physics has revealed that time is not absolute, that it can be dilated and distorted by gravity and velocity, that the passage of time is relative to the observer. Could ancient peoples have had some intuition about this? Could they have experienced or conceived of time in ways that we, locked into our linear, clock-driven modern perspective, can no longer comprehend? This interpretation ventures into speculative territory, but it is worth considering. Many ancient cultures had conceptions of time that differed radically from our own. The Maya, for instance, used multiple interlocking calendars simultaneously, tracking different cycles that ranged from days to millennia. The Hindus conceived of time as operating on truly cosmic scales, with ages lasting millions or billions of years. The Greeks had the concept of kairos, sacred time, which was qualitatively different from chronos, chronological time. What if the antediluvian kings ruled not in chronological time, but in some other form of time, a sacred or cosmic time that does not translate easily into our modern understanding? What if the 241,200 years represent not duration as we conceive it, but rather a different dimension of temporal experience? These are strange questions, and they lead us into realms where history and metaphysics merge. But the King List itself is a strange document, one that resists easy categorization. It is simultaneously a historical record, a mythological narrative, a piece of religious scripture, and perhaps an encoded scientific text. Trying to force it into a single interpretive framework inevitably leaves part of its meaning unexplained. Perhaps the best approach is to hold multiple interpretations simultaneously, to recognize that the King List may be operating on several levels at once. On one level, it is a mythological account of the origin of kingship, explaining how divine authority came to be vested in human rulers. On another level, it is a distorted historical memory of pre-flood civilizations, perhaps real cultures that existed before catastrophic flooding reshaped the landscape of Mesopotamia. On yet another level, it is an astronomical or mathematical text encoding knowledge about celestial cycles and cosmic order. And on the deepest level, it may be a meditation on the nature of time itself, on the relationship between the eternal and the temporal, the divine and the human. What makes the King List so enduring and so fascinating is precisely this multivalence, its ability to function simultaneously as history, myth, science, and philosophy. The Sumerians did not separate these categories the way we do. For them, history was inseparable from theology, science from religion, the practical from the sacred. When they recorded the reigns of the antediluvian kings, they were doing all of these things at once, preserving memory, honouring the gods, transmitting knowledge, and contemplating the mysteries of existence. And this brings us back to the central question: what were they trying to tell us? What message did they encode in those impossible numbers, in the names of those 8 mythical kings? Perhaps the message is simply this: that civilization is older and stranger than we imagine, that human history extends back into depths of time that we have not yet fathomed, that the world has ended and begun again more times than we remember. The flood that swept over was not the first catastrophe humanity has endured, nor will it be the last. Civilizations rise and fall like the tides, and each one believes itself to be the first and the greatest, only to be humbled by time and disaster. The antediluvian kings, ruling their impossible reigns over vanished cities, remind us that we are not the beginning of the story. We are somewhere in the middle, standing on foundations laid by people whose very existence has been forgotten, whose names survive only as entries in an ancient king list, whose accomplishments have been reduced to dust. But the patterns endure. Kingship, that fundamental principle of political and cosmic order, descends and ascends in cycles. Knowledge is gained and lost and gained again. And always, there are those who remember, who preserve the fragments, who pass down the stories even when their original meaning has become obscure. The Sumerians were those rememberers for their age, and we are the rememberers for ours. We have inherited their clay tablets, their myths, their mathematics, their anxieties, and their hopes. And we have added our own, building new layers on top of the old, just as they built their cities on top of the ruins of those who came before. One day, if our civilization lasts long enough, future archaeologists will dig through our remains and try to make sense of what we left behind. They will find our texts and our technologies, and perhaps they will wonder, as we wonder now about the Sumerians, how much we truly understood, how much we were simply preserving from some earlier source, how much was memory and how much was invention. And perhaps they too will find a document like the King List, something from our age that records impossibilities, that speaks of things that should not be but somehow are, that preserves a message from a world that no longer exists. The cycle continues. The flood comes again in new forms, and the clay tablets, or their digital equivalents, wait to be unearthed by those who come after, who will try to decode our secrets as we try to decode the secrets of those who came before. In this way, we are all part of the same continuum, the same vast story that began when kingship first descended from heaven and will continue until kingship ascends for the last time, or perhaps until it descends once more to start the cycle anew. The 8 antediluvian kings stand at the threshold of this story, guardians of the boundary between the knowable and the unknowable, between history and myth. Their names have survived for over 4,000 years, copied and recopied by scribes who believed in their importance, preserved through the fall of empires and the rise of new religions. And they will continue to survive, these 8 impossible kings, these markers of lost time, because they represent something fundamental about the human condition. Our need to remember where we came from, our awareness that we are part of something larger than ourselves, our suspicion that the past holds secrets we have not yet uncovered, our hope that somewhere, buried beneath the layers of forgetting, lies the truth about who we are and who we were meant to be. The clay tablets that record the King List are fragile things, easily broken, slowly eroding, but the story they tell is not fragile. It has outlasted the civilization that created it. It has survived the very flood it describes, and it will continue to survive in fragments and copies and reconstructions as long as there are people who wonder about the deep past, who refuse to accept that history begins only with written records, who sense that the timeline we have constructed is incomplete. Somewhere in southern Iraq, beneath the sand and the ruins of more recent cities, lie the remains of Eridu, the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven. Archaeologists have excavated part of it, revealing the foundations of temples built one on top of another, each generation maintaining the sacred site. But beneath the lowest level they have reached, there are surely more layers, more temples, more settlements, extending back into prehistory. How deep do they go? How far back does the story of Eridu truly extend? The King List says that Alulim ruled there for 28,800 years. Archaeology can confirm only a few thousand years of occupation. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we have not yet found traces of occupation dating back 28,000 years does not mean it did not exist. The deeper we dig, both literally and figuratively, the older the human story becomes. And perhaps someday, in some unexpected place, we will find something that confirms what the Sumerians were trying to tell us all along. That the timeline is wrong. that civilization is ancient beyond measure, that before the flood there were kings who ruled for impossibly long ages, presiding over a world we can barely imagine. Until that day comes, if it ever does, we are left with the clay tablets and the numbers they record: 241,200 years. 8 kings, 5 cities, 1 flood, and the enduring mystery of what it all means. The numbers themselves are a language, a code that the Sumerians left for us to decipher. When we look at them closely, patterns emerge that suggest deep mathematical and astronomical knowledge. The number 3,600, the Shah, is the fundamental unit. It is 60 times 60, the product of the base of the Sumerian numerical system multiplied by itself. But 3,600 is also significant astronomically. It is close to the number of days in 10 years, making it a convenient unit for measuring long periods of time. And when we consider that the Sumerians divided the circle into 360 degrees, we see that they were thinking in terms of cycles and rotations, of things that return to their starting point after a complete revolution. The reigns of the 8 antediluvian kings are all multiples of 3,600. Alalim ruled for 8 Shahs, Alalgar for 10, Enmen-Luana for 12, Enmen-Galana for 8, Dumuzi for 10, Ensipaziana for 8, Enmen-Durana for 5.8, and Ubara-Tutu for 5.2. The total is 67 Shahs, or 241,200 years. These numbers are too precise, too carefully structured to be random. They are encoding something, but what? One possibility is that they encode precessional cycles. The precession of the equinoxes is caused by the slow wobble of Earth's rotation axis, which takes approximately 25,920 years to complete one full cycle. This is sometimes called the Great Year or the Platonic Year. The Sumerians may have known about precession, or at least observed its effects, the gradual shift of the constellations relative to the horizon over long periods of time. If we divide 241,200 by 25,920, we get approximately 9.3, suggesting that the total span of the antediluvian reigns represents about 9 complete precessional cycles. But the math is not exact, which raises questions. Were the Sumerians approximating? Were they encoding a slightly different cycle? Or were they measuring something else entirely? Another astronomical phenomenon that operates on similar timescales is the wobble of the ecliptic, the plane of Earth's orbit around the Sun. This wobble has a period of about 40,000 years. If we consider that the longest reign in the king list is 43,200 years, we see that it is close to this period. Could the antediluvian kings represent not just precessional ages, but multiple overlapping astronomical cycles? The more we examine the numbers, the more complex they become. They seem to be encoding multiple layers of meaning simultaneously, like a musical chord that contains several notes played together. On one level, they are measuring time, vast spans of cosmic time. On another level, they are measuring celestial cycles, the movements of stars and planets. On yet another level, they may be encoding mathematical relationships, ratios, and proportions that had sacred significance to the Sumerians. And on the deepest level, they may be telling a story about the nature of reality itself, about how the cosmos is structured, about the relationship between time and space and consciousness. This multi-layered encoding is characteristic of ancient wisdom traditions. The sacred texts and myths of many cultures operate on multiple levels simultaneously, offering different meanings to different readers depending on their level of understanding. The uninitiated might read them as simple stories, while the initiated would recognize the deeper teachings encoded within them. The Sumerian king list may be such a text, a document designed to preserve knowledge in a form that would survive even if its original context was lost. But there is another, more troubling possibility. What if the numbers are not symbolic at all? What if they are, in some sense we do not yet understand, literally true? What if the antediluvian kings really did rule for those impossible spans of time, but in a reality or dimension where time operates differently than it does in our current world? This may sound like science fiction, but modern physics has opened up possibilities that would have seemed equally fantastic to earlier generations. We now know that time is relative, that it passes at different rates depending on gravity and velocity. We know that the universe is far stranger than common sense suggests, with phenomena like quantum entanglement and dark energy that defy intuitive understanding. We know that our perception of reality is limited, that we can only sense a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum, that there may be dimensions of existence that we cannot perceive at all. Is it possible that the antediluvian age was characterized by conditions that we cannot currently comprehend? Conditions in which time flowed differently, in which consciousness operated on different principles, in which beings existed that do not fit into our current categories of human and divine. This is the kind of speculation that makes academics uncomfortable, and rightly so. We cannot build a rigorous understanding of the past on wild speculation and unfalsifiable hypotheses, but we also cannot dismiss the possibility that our current framework of understanding is incomplete, that there are aspects of ancient history and human consciousness that our materialist, reductionist paradigm cannot adequately explain. The Sumerians themselves would have had no trouble with the idea that reality contains multiple levels and dimensions. Their cosmology was rich and complex, with the heavens, the earth, and the underworld all interpenetrating, with gods and humans and spirits all coexisting in a universe that was alive and conscious. When they spoke of the antediluvian kings ruling for tens of thousands of years, they may have meant something that we can no longer quite grasp, something that requires us to expand our understanding of what is possible. The clay tablets sit in museums now behind glass, labelled and catalogued, reduced to historical artifacts, but they were not created as museum pieces. They were created as living documents, as vessels of knowledge and memory, as links in a chain of transmission that stretched back into the deep past and forward into an unknown future. When the Sumerian scribes pressed their stelae into wet clay, creating those distinctive wedge-shaped marks, they were not just recording information, they were performing an act of defiance against time and death and forgetting. They were saying, this matters, this must not be lost. Future generations must know what we know. And they were successful. 4,000 years later, we can still read their words, still puzzle over their numbers, still wonder about the 8 kings who ruled before the flood. The transmission has worked, imperfectly perhaps, but it has worked. The message has been received, even if we are not yet sure what it means. This is the true miracle of writing, not that it records what happened, but that it creates a bridge across time, allowing minds separated by millennia to communicate. When you read the King List, you are in direct contact with the consciousness of the ancient scribes who wrote it. You are seeing what they saw, thinking about what they thought about, struggling with the same questions that troubled them. The clay mediates between you and them, carrying meaning across an abyss of time that would otherwise be unbridgeable. And what those scribes wanted you to know above all else is that the past is deeper than you think, that human history does not begin with the first written records, but extends back into depths that can barely be imagined, that before the world, there were other worlds, other ages, other kings, that the flood destroyed not just cities but entire epochs, erasing civilizations so completely that only fragmentary memories remain, that we are not the first, that others came before us, that we stand on foundations laid by people we can no longer name. This knowledge should humble us. Our civilization, for all its achievements, is merely one more chapter in a story that began long before we existed and will continue long after we are gone. The cities we build will crumble into ruins, just as Eridu and Uruk crumbled. The languages we speak will be forgotten, just as Sumerian was forgotten. The gods we worship will fade into myth, just as Enki and Inanna faded. All of it is temporary, all of it is fragile, all of it will pass, but the pattern endures, the cycle continues, and somewhere in the ruins of our civilization, future archaeologists will find our own version of the King List, our own attempt to record and preserve and pass on what we knew. The Sumerian King List teaches us that memory is the most precious thing we have, more valuable than gold or temples or monuments. Memory is what connects us to the past and to each other. Memory is what makes us human. When the flood swept over and destroyed the antediluvian world, the greatest loss was not the buildings or the art or even the people. The greatest loss was memory, the knowledge of who those people were and what they had achieved. The Sumerians tried to recover that lost memory, to reconstruct it from fragments and echoes, and they recorded their reconstruction in the King List. They knew it was imperfect, they knew the numbers were impossible, but they also knew that imperfect memory is better than no memory at all, that to preserve even a distorted echo of the past is better than to let it vanish completely. This is why they copied the King List so many times, why they maintained it for over 1,000 years, why they treated it with such reverence. It was not just a historical document, it was a sacred trust, a responsibility to the past and to the future, a recognition that we are all links in a chain of memory that must not be broken. And now that trust has been passed to us, we are the inheritors of the King List, the keepers of its impossible numbers, the ones responsible for transmitting its message to future generations. What we do with that responsibility is up to us. We can dismiss the King List as primitive mythology, as the confused ramblings of people who did not understand the difference between fact and fiction. We can try to explain it away, to reduce it to something comfortable and comprehensible, to fit it into our neat timelines and evolutionary models. Or we can do what the Sumerians did. We can preserve it, even though we do not fully understand it. We can pass it on, even though it challenges our assumptions. We can honor the memory it contains, even though that memory is fragmentary and strange. we can recognize that the past is not dead and buried, but alive and present, still speaking to us across the millennia, still trying to tell us something important about who we are and where we came from. The 8 antediluvian kings, Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, Dumuzi, Ensipaziana, Enmendurana, Ubaratutu, are waiting. They have been waiting for over 4,000 years, patient as the clay that records their names. They are waiting for us to understand, to decode the message they carry, to bridge the gap between their world and ours. They are waiting for us to remember 241,200 years, 8 kings, 5 cities, 1 flood. The numbers are carved in clay, preserved against all odds, transmitted across impossible distances of time and space. They are a puzzle, a mystery, a challenge. They are the Sumerians' gift to us, their way of saying the world is older than you think, stranger than you imagine, more mysterious than you can comprehend. And if you are wise, you will not try to solve the mystery, but rather sit with it, dwell in it, let it transform your understanding of what is possible. The flood swept over, and the world was remade, but the memory survived, encoded in impossible numbers, waiting to be rediscovered in an age that had learned to read but had forgotten how to wonder. Now, standing at the threshold between the known and the unknown, between the historical and the mythological, we have a choice. We can close the door on the past, declare that anything that does not fit our models must be false, retreat into the safety of conventional thinking, or we can open ourselves to the possibility that the ancients knew things we have forgotten, that they preserved truths we have not yet rediscovered, that their impossible numbers point toward realities we cannot yet perceive. The Sumerian king list is not asking us to believe blindly in literal kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. It is asking us to expand our imagination, to consider possibilities we have been trained to dismiss, to recognize that the universe is larger and stranger than we have been taught. It is asking us to remember, and in that remembering, perhaps we will rediscover something essential that was lost when the flood swept over. Not just historical facts or chronological data, but a way of being in the world, a connection to cosmic rhythms, an awareness of our place in the vast cycles of time. The antediluvian age, whatever it was, represented a different mode of human existence, one in which the boundaries between earth and heaven, human and divine, were more fluid. The flood destroyed that world, and we have been living in its aftermath ever since, cut off from sources of wisdom and power that were once available to our ancestors. The king list is a map back to that lost world, or perhaps a key to unlocking something within ourselves that has been dormant since the flood. The numbers are coordinates, the names are signposts, the whole text is a guide for those willing to make the journey back into deep time. But the journey requires courage. It requires us to let go of certainties, to question assumptions, to entertain possibilities that seem absurd. It requires us to acknowledge that we do not know everything, that our ancestors were not primitive or foolish, that the past may contain truths that the present has forgotten. The Sumerians made that journey. They looked back into the abyss of time and saw the 8 kings, the pre-flood world, the golden age when heaven and earth were one. They recorded what they saw, even though they knew it would seem impossible to future generations. They did it because they understood something we are only beginning to relearn, that the past is not behind us but within us, encoded in our myths and our dreams and our deepest intuitions about who we are. The flood that swept over did not erase the antediluvian world completely. It buried it, submerged it, covered it with layers of sediment and forgetting. But it is still there, waiting beneath the surface, ready to be rediscovered by those who know where to dig. The clay tablets are maps to that buried world. The numbers are keys to unlocking its secrets. And the 8 kings, those impossible rulers with their impossible reigns, are guardians at the threshold, testing us, challenging us, asking us if we have the courage and the vision to remember what we have spent millennia trying to forget. This is the truth they tried to hide, or that we have hidden from ourselves. That human history is not a simple story of progress from primitive to advanced, from savage to civilized, from ignorant to enlightened. That history is cyclical, that civilizations rise and fall, that knowledge is gained and lost and gained again, that we are not the pinnacle of human achievement, but rather one more iteration in an endless cycle, building on ruins we do not remember, destined to become ruins that future generations will not understand. The Sumerian king list is a reminder of this cycle, a warning and a promise. It warns us that what we build can be destroyed, that floods come in many forms, that civilizations are more fragile than we like to believe. But it also promises that memory survives, that knowledge can be preserved, that even after the greatest catastrophes, humanity rebuilds and remembers and continues the story. We stand now at a unique moment in that story. We have tools the Sumerians never dreamed of, technologies that allow us to see farther and deeper than ever before. We can explore the ocean floor where ancient cities might lie submerged. We can analyze ice cores and sediment layers to reconstruct past climates. We can sequence DNA to trace human migrations. We can decode ancient languages and read texts that have been lost for millennia. With these tools, we have the possibility of confirming or refuting what the Sumerians tried to tell us. We can search for the submerged lands where pre-flood civilizations might have existed. We can look for evidence of catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age. We can excavate deeper beneath the ruins of Eridu and Uruk and see how far back human occupation really extends. We can compare the king list with similar documents from other cultures and look for patterns. The quest to understand the Sumerian king list is not just an academic exercise. It is a quest to understand ourselves, to discover the truth about human origins and human history, to recover knowledge that has been lost. It is a quest that has been ongoing since the first clay tablets were unearthed over a century ago, and it is far from over. New discoveries are being made all the time, new interpretations proposed, new connections drawn. The mystery deepens even as our knowledge expands. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the king list was never meant to provide easy answers, but rather to provoke questions, to inspire wonder, to remind us that the past is not a closed book but an open horizon, full of possibilities we have not yet explored. The 8 antediluvian kings, those impossible rulers with their impossible reigns, stand at that horizon, beckoning us forward, inviting us to cross the boundary between the known and the unknown, between history and myth, between what we believe possible and what the evidence suggests might be true. They are waiting, patient as ever, carved in clay that has endured for millennia, and will endure for millennia more. Their names will outlast our names, their numbers will outlast our theories, their mystery will outlast our certainties, and perhaps someday, in a future we cannot imagine, someone will finally decode the message fully, will understand what the Sumerians were trying to tell us about those 241,200 years of rule before the flood. When that day comes, human history will be rewritten, the timeline will be redrawn, and we will finally understand our place in the vast story of civilization on Earth, a story that is older and stranger and more wonderful than we ever imagined. Until then, we have the clay tablets, we have the numbers, we have the names, we have the flood, and we have the enduring mystery of the Sumerian kings they tried to hide, or that time tried to erase, or that we are only now beginning to remember. The quest continues. The cycle turns. And somewhere in the deep past, the 8 kings wait, guardians of a truth too vast to be contained, too important to be forgotten, too strange to be believed, and yet somehow, impossibly, undeniably real. The clay itself is a witness, not just to what was written upon it, but to the hands that shaped it, the breath that hovered over it as the scribe worked, the intention that guided every wedge pressed into its surface. When we hold a tablet inscribed with the king list, we are holding more than information. We are holding time made solid, memory made tangible, an act of will frozen in fired earth. The Sumerians understood this. They knew that clay, transformed by fire, could outlast bronze, outlast stone, outlast the very cities in which it was created. They knew that what they wrote would survive them, would speak when their voices had long since fallen silent, would carry their message into a future they could not imagine. And what a message it is! Not just a list of names and numbers, but a cosmology, a philosophy, a way of understanding the relationship between humanity and time. The king list is saying something profound about the nature of existence itself, about how the world works, about the forces that shape civilizations and the patterns that govern their rise and fall. It is saying that time is not what we think it is, that history moves in cycles too vast for individual human comprehension, that we are part of something much larger and older than ourselves. The antediluvian kings with their impossible reigns are not anomalies or errors. They are the key to understanding this larger pattern, the code that unlocks a different way of seeing reality. Consider for a moment what it means to rule for 28,800 years, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but as an experiential reality. What would consciousness be like across such a span? How would memory function? How would identity persist? These are not idle questions. They point towards something fundamental about the nature of awareness itself. Modern science tells us that consciousness is intimately connected to time, that our sense of self is constructed from memories of the past and anticipations of the future, that without temporal flow there can be no experience. But what if there are other modes of consciousness, other ways of experiencing time that we have lost access to or never fully developed? What if the antediluvian kings represent not just a different historical period, but a different state of being? The mystical traditions of many cultures speak of expanded states of consciousness in which time operates differently. Yogis report experiences of timelessness during deep meditation. Shamans speak of journeys through time in visionary states. Near-death experiencers describe their entire lives flashing before them in an instant, yet with perfect clarity and detail, as if time had somehow folded in on itself. Modern physics tells us that time is relative, that it can stretch and compress, that past, present, and future may not be as separate as our everyday experience suggests. What if the antediluvian age was characterized by a different relationship to time, a different mode of consciousness that allowed for lifespans and experiences that would be impossible under our current conditions? This is not to suggest that individual human beings literally lived for tens of thousands of years in the biological sense. The human body, as we know it, could not sustain itself for such periods. Cells age, DNA degrades, accumulated damage eventually overwhelms repair mechanisms. But consciousness may be another matter. If consciousness is not entirely dependent on the physical body, if it can exist in states or forms that we do not currently understand, then the reigns of the antediluvian kings might represent something real, but real in a way that transcends our ordinary categories of understanding. They might represent lineages of consciousness, streams of awareness that persisted across many physical lifetimes, maintaining continuity of identity and purpose across spans of time that would obliterate any individual personality. This idea appears in various forms across different traditions. The Tibetan Tulku system, in which high lamas are reborn repeatedly and recognized in their new incarnations, preserves a kind of consciousness continuity across lifetimes. The Egyptian concept of the Ka, the spiritual double that survives death, suggests a level of identity that transcends individual existence. The Hindu notion of the Atman, the eternal self that incarnates repeatedly, points toward consciousness as something independent of any particular body or lifetime. What if the antediluvian kings were masters of this kind of consciousness continuity, able to maintain their identity and purpose across vast spans of time, perhaps through reincarnation, perhaps through some other means we do not yet understand? Or perhaps the answer lies in a different direction entirely. Perhaps the antediluvian kings were not human at all, at least not in the sense that we understand humanity. The Sumerians did not clearly distinguish between gods and kings in the antediluvian period. The boundary between divine and human was fluid, permeable. The king list itself says that kingship descended from heaven, implying that the first rulers came from somewhere else, from some other realm or dimension of existence. Many ancient texts describe the gods as having lifespans far exceeding those of humans, as existing on a different timescale altogether. The Hindu Puranas speak of the Devas living for thousands or millions of years. The Greek gods were immortal. The Egyptian gods were eternal. What if these descriptions are not purely mythological? What if they preserve memories of actual beings who existed on different timescales than ordinary humans? Not necessarily aliens from other planets, though that is one possibility, but perhaps beings from other dimensions of reality, other levels of existence that interpenetrate with our own. Modern physics, with its theories of multiple dimensions and parallel universes, has opened up conceptual space for such possibilities. String theory requires at least 10 dimensions for its mathematics to work. Quantum mechanics suggests that reality is far stranger than our everyday experience indicates, with particles existing in multiple states simultaneously and becoming entangled across vast distances. If reality is indeed multidimensional, if there are levels of existence that we cannot normally perceive, then perhaps the antediluvian kings came from or had access to these other dimensions, and their impossible lifespans reflect the different temporal properties of those realms. This interpretation would explain many puzzling features of the king list and of ancient mythology more generally. It would explain why the antediluvian kings seem so different from later historical rulers, because they were different, fundamentally so. It would explain why their knowledge seems to have been so advanced, because they brought it from elsewhere, from a realm where consciousness operates differently and understands things that are hidden from us. It would explain why the flood marks such a clear break, because it represented not just a geological catastrophe but a withdrawal, a separation, a closing of the doors between dimensions. After the flood, the gods retreated, kingship ascended to heaven, and humanity was left on its own, cut off from the sources of wisdom and power that had previously been accessible. But we must be careful not to drift too far into speculation without grounding ourselves in what we actually know. What we know is this: the Sumerians, one of the most advanced and sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world, recorded a king list that places 8 rulers before the flood, each ruling for thousands of years. They preserved this record carefully across many centuries, copying it repeatedly, maintaining its consistency even as their own society changed and evolved. They treated it as important, as meaningful, as true in some sense that mattered to them. They embedded it within their understanding of history and their relationship to the divine, and they passed it down to us, across an abyss of time, as a message, a warning, a key to something they wanted us to understand. We also know that floods did occur in Mesopotamia, multiple floods, some local and some possibly much larger. We know that sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age, submerging vast areas that had previously been above water. We know that human civilization is older than we once thought, that complex societies existed far earlier than conventional archaeology long maintained. We know that there are gaps in our timeline, periods for which we have little evidence, entire landscapes that are now underwater and unexplored. We know that the antediluvian kings of Sumer are echoed by similar figures in other ancient traditions, suggesting either a common origin or a common human experience that gave rise to similar stories. And we know that the numbers in the king list are not random. They follow patterns, mathematical relationships, connections to astronomical cycles. They are encoded, deliberately structured, designed to convey something beyond surface meaning. The Sumerians were brilliant mathematicians and astronomers. They would not have used these specific numbers without reason. Whatever the king list is, it is not the naive mythology of primitive people. It is a sophisticated document created by a sophisticated culture, and it deserves to be taken seriously, even if we do not yet fully understand it. Perhaps the truth lies in synthesis, in combining multiple levels of interpretation rather than choosing just one. Perhaps the king list is simultaneously preserving historical memory, encoding astronomical knowledge, expressing theological truths, and pointing toward metaphysical realities. Perhaps it operates on all these levels at once, speaking different messages to different readers in different times. To the ancient Sumerian, it was a sacred text connecting them to their divine origins. To the astronomer priest, it was a calendar of cosmic cycles. To the initiated mystic, It was a map of consciousness evolution. To the historian, it was a compressed record of ages so ancient that only their shadows remained. And to us, standing in our own time with our own tools and perspectives, it is an invitation to expand our understanding, to question our assumptions, to recognize that we do not have all the answers. The 8 kings stand before us like a riddle: Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, Dumuzi, Ensipaziana, Enmendurana, Ubara Tutu. Say their names aloud. Feel how they sound in your mouth, how they resonate in your chest. These are not ordinary words. They carry power, antiquity, weight. They have survived when everything else from their age has turned to dust. They are the last voices from a world that no longer exists, calling across the void, asking to be heard, demanding to be remembered. What were they like, these 8? What did they see? What did they know? How did they experience existence during those vast epochs when they ruled? We can imagine them standing on the walls of Eridu, looking out over a landscape utterly different from the one we know. The Persian Gulf did not exist yet. Where there is now water, there was land, green and fertile, watered by rivers that no longer flow. Cities dotted this landscape. Cities whose names we do not know, whose ruins lie beneath hundreds of feet of water and sediment. The climate was different, the stars were different, their positions in the sky shifted by the slow turning of the precessional cycle. The very air might have been different, charged with something we have lost, some quality or presence that made the boundary between physical and spiritual more permeable. The first king, Alulim, would have walked in a world still fresh from creation, still humming with the energy of beginnings. He was the template, the original, the one who defined what kingship would mean for all the ages to come. Did he know how long his reign would last? Did he count the years as they passed, 1,000, 10,000, 20,000, watching generations of ordinary humans live and die while he endured? Or did time feel different to him, not a burden to be endured, but a gift to be savoured, each year as fresh and new as the first? We cannot know. We can only wonder and imagine and try to piece together from fragments what the reality might have been. After Alulim came Alalgar, and the reign continued, now in its second phase, another 36,000 years of stability and order. What changed between the age of Alulim and the age of Alalgar? Did the culture evolve? Did new technologies develop? Did the relationship between humans and gods shift in some way? The king list gives us only names and numbers, no details, no stories, no glimpses into the texture of daily life. It is maddeningly sparse, like a skeleton without flesh, a framework without filling. But perhaps that sparseness is deliberate. Perhaps the scribes knew that details would make the account seem even more incredible, that by stripping it down to bare essentials, they would preserve what was most important: the structure, the pattern, the cycle itself. Then kingship moved from Eridu to Bad Tibira, and the age of Enmenluana began, the longest reign of all, 43,200 years. What does it mean for kingship to move from one city to another? Was it a transfer of power, a shift in political authority, or does it represent something else, a change in the cosmic order, a rotation of the axis of civilization from one pole to another? Bad Tibira was the city of metalworking, of craft and skill and the transformation of raw materials into finished goods. Perhaps the move to Bad Tibira represents humanity's maturation, the development of technology, the beginning of the process by which we learned to reshape our environment rather than simply accepting it as given. Enmenluana, the Lord of Light, presided over this age of development. Under his rule and that of his successor Enmengalana, humanity learned the arts that would define civilization: metallurgy, agriculture, architecture, mathematics, astronomy. All the foundations of complex society might have been established during this vast epoch. And then came Dumuzi, the shepherd, connecting the royal lineage to the pastoral, to the care of flocks, to the cycles of birth and death and renewal that govern all life. Dumuzi's inclusion in the antediluvian list is significant because he appears later as a god, as the dying and reviving deity whose annual death and resurrection were mourned and celebrated in Sumerian ritual. He is a bridge figure, connecting the age before the flood to the age after, showing that some things persist, that some patterns endure even across the greatest catastrophes. After Dumuzi came the last three kings: Enzipaziana of Larak, Enmendarana of Sippar, and finally Ubara Tutu of Shurapak. The reigns are getting shorter now: 28,800 years, 21,000 years, 18,600 years. Still impossibly long by human standards, but shorter than those that came before. Is this progression significant? Does it represent a winding down, a preparation for the end? Or is it simply the natural variation of different cosmic cycles, some longer, some shorter, according to the rhythms of the heavens? The fact that the last three kings ruled over three different cities might suggest a fragmentation, a decentralization, as if the unified order of the early antediluvian period was beginning to break down, preparing for the chaos that the flood would bring. Enmendarana, the seventh king, deserves special attention. As mentioned earlier, he is associated with the seventh of the Apkallu, the seven sages who brought civilization to humanity. In later Babylonian tradition, Enmendarana was said to have been taken up to heaven, where he was shown the secrets of divination and the mysteries of the cosmos. He was, in essence, the keeper of hidden knowledge, the one who bridged the gap between human and divine wisdom. His name contains the element dur, suggesting endurance, lasting preservation. Could it be that Enmendarana's role was specifically to preserve knowledge across the flood boundary, to ensure that what was learned in the antediluvian age would not be entirely lost when the waters came? This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of the king list: its relationship to the concept of the Apkallu. The Apkallu were seven sages described in various Mesopotamian texts as having come from the sea to teach humanity the arts of civilization. They were associated with the god Enki, who dwelt in the Abzu, the cosmic ocean beneath the earth. 4 of the Apkallu were said to have lived before the flood, and 3 after. They were not quite human and not quite divine, occupying an intermediate status, wise beings who served as intermediaries between gods and men. The connection between the Apkallu and the antediluvian kings is not made explicit in the texts, but it is suggestive. Both represent knowledge from before the flood. Both are associated with the establishment of civilization. Both link the human world to divine or cosmic sources of wisdom. Could the antediluvian kings and the Apkallu be 2 different ways of describing the same phenomenon? Could they be 2 different traditions that preserved memories of the same events or beings? Or were they separate but related, the kings providing political and cosmic order while the sages provided knowledge and wisdom? The texts do not give us clear answers, but they invite us to think about the relationship between different forms of authority and different sources of knowledge. Kingship descends from heaven. bringing divine order to the human realm. Wisdom comes from the Abzu, rising from the depths, emerging from the unconscious, or from hidden dimensions of reality. Together, they establish civilization, creating a culture that is both ordered and wise, both structured and inspired. But then the flood came, and everything changed. The texts are quite clear about this. The flood was not a natural disaster in the ordinary sense. It was a decision, an act of will by the gods, a deliberate cleansing of the earth. Why? What had gone wrong? What had humanity done, or what had the world become that required such drastic measures? Different texts give different reasons. Some say humanity had become too numerous and too noisy, disturbing the peace of the gods. Others suggest moral corruption, wickedness, the breakdown of divine order. Still others present the flood as simply the end of an age, a necessary reset, a cosmic cleaning that prepares the ground for a new cycle to begin. There is something deeply unsettling about this aspect of the flood story. It suggests that existence is not safe, that the world can be unmade as easily as it was made, that we live always on the edge of catastrophe. But it also suggests something else, something more hopeful. It suggests that destruction is not final, that after the flood comes renewal, that the pattern can be re-established, even after it has been shattered. Ziusudra survives. He builds his boat, he preserves the seeds of life, and when the waters recede, he becomes the link between the old world and the new. Through him, something essential is preserved, passed forward, maintained across the break in continuity. This is crucial. The flood separates, but it does not completely sever. There is transmission across the boundary. Ziusudra carries with him not just his own life, but the memory of what came before. He becomes, in essence, the eighth king transformed, the last representative of the antediluvian age who survives to see the new world born. And through him, the knowledge of the me is preserved, the principles of civilization are maintained, the connection to divine wisdom is not entirely lost. The gods grant him immortality, removing him from the cycle of death and rebirth, making him an eternal witness to the truth of what happened, a living testament to the reality of the flood and the world that existed before it. When we think about the king list in this context, we realize that it is not just a record of the past, it is a promise for the future. It is saying that even after the greatest catastrophes, even after civilizations are destroyed and worlds are swept away, the pattern can be recovered. Knowledge can be regained. The connection to divine sources can be re-established. We are not cut off permanently from what was lost. We are only separated temporarily, and if we are diligent, if we preserve the fragments, if we maintain the memory, we can rebuild. This is what the Sumerians were doing with their king list. They were maintaining the memory, preserving the fragments, keeping alive the knowledge that there had been a world before and that its wisdom could be recovered. This understanding transforms how we read the impossible numbers. They are not meant to be believed literally, but they are also not meant to be dismissed as fantasy. They are meant to function as anchors, as markers, as ways of saying this is real, this matters, this must not be forgotten. The enormity of the numbers is precisely the point. They are designed to shock us, to jar us out of our comfortable assumptions, to force us to confront the possibility that history is not what we think it is. If the numbers were reasonable, if they fit easily into our timelines and our expectations, we would file them away and forget about them. But because they are impossible, because they challenge us, we remember them, we puzzle over them, we keep coming back to them generation after generation, trying to understand what they mean. And perhaps that is exactly what the Sumerian scribes intended. Perhaps they encoded the king list with impossible numbers precisely so that it would not be forgotten, so that future generations would be forced to grapple with it, to think about it, to preserve it. In this sense, the king list is not a failure of historical record keeping. It is a brilliant success of memory preservation. 4,000 years later, we are still talking about it, still thinking about it, still trying to decode its message. How many historical documents from that era have survived with such power? How many ancient texts still command such attention, still provoke such intense interest and debate? The king list has survived because it is important, and it is important because it is saying something that we need to hear, even if we do not yet fully understand it. It is saying that we come from something older and greater than we know. It is saying that our civilization is built on foundations laid in ages so remote that we can barely imagine them. It is saying that the world has ended before and will end again, but that the pattern endures, that knowledge can be preserved, that memory survives even the greatest floods. It is saying that we are connected to the deep past, that we carry within us the legacy of those 8 antediluvian kings, whether they were literal rulers or symbolic representations of ages or something else entirely. This connection to the past is not abstract or theoretical. It is concrete and practical. Everything we are, everything we know, everything our civilization has achieved rests on foundations laid by those who came before us. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, law, art, religion, all of these were developed over vast spans of time by countless people whose names we do not know. We inherit their wisdom, their discoveries, their hard-won knowledge, but we also inherit their forgetting, the knowledge that was lost when civilizations fell, when libraries burned, when traditions were broken. The king list reminds us of both aspects of our heritage, what we have preserved and what we have lost, and it challenges us to think about our own role in this ongoing story. What will we preserve? What will we pass on to future generations? When the next flood comes, and it will come in one form or another, what fragments of our civilization will survive? What will we have carved into imperishable clay, or whatever the equivalent is in our digital age? These are not idle questions. We live in a time of unprecedented change, of accelerating technological development, of growing environmental challenges. The world our children inherit will be very different from the one we know. What do we want them to remember about us? What knowledge do we need to preserve for them? The Sumerians faced similar questions. They lived in the aftermath of the flood, trying to rebuild civilization from fragments, trying to recover lost knowledge, trying to understand where they had come from and how to avoid the mistakes that had led to catastrophe. They responded by becoming obsessive record keepers, by writing everything down, by creating systems for preserving and transmitting knowledge. They invented writing specifically for this purpose, to create a more reliable form of memory than oral tradition alone could provide. They built libraries and schools, trained scribes, created standardized texts that could be copied and distributed. They understood that civilization depends on memory, that without records, we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, that only by preserving knowledge can we hope to build on what came before rather than constantly starting over from scratch. The king list is part of this project of memory preservation. It is the Sumerians' way of anchoring their civilization in deep time, of connecting themselves to the most ancient past they could imagine. By claiming descent from the antediluvian kings, they were claiming legitimacy, authority, and continuity with the original divine order. They were saying, "We are not upstarts or newcomers. We are the inheritors of the most ancient tradition, the keepers of the oldest knowledge, the guardians of the primordial pattern." This claim gave them confidence, identity, and purpose. It told them who they were and why they mattered. It connected their small lives to vast cosmic cycles, making their individual existence meaningful as part of a larger story. We need similar anchoring today. In our modern world, with its rapid changes and constant disruptions, many people feel unmoored, disconnected from the past, uncertain about the future. We have lost our sense of historical depth, our connection to the long story of human civilization. We think in terms of quarters and fiscal years, election cycles and technological product releases, time scales that are laughably short compared to the vast spans recorded in the king list. We need to recover a sense of deep time, to understand ourselves as part of a story that began long before us and will continue long after we are gone. The king list helps us do this. It forces us to think in terms of thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, timescales that dwarf our individual lives, but are appropriate for thinking about civilizational processes. It reminds us that change happens slowly, that cultures evolve over millennia, that the patterns that shape history operate on scales far larger than we can perceive in our day-to-day existence. This perspective is humbling but also liberating. It takes the pressure off our individual lives while simultaneously giving them deeper meaning. We do not have to solve all problems or achieve all goals in our lifetime. We are part of a much longer process, contributors to a story that is still being written. But the king list also warns us. It says that civilizations can fall, that knowledge can be lost, that even the mightiest achievements can be swept away. The antediluvian age, with all its wisdom and power and divine connection, was destroyed. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is guaranteed. We cannot take our civilization for granted, assuming it will continue simply because it has existed for a while. We must actively work to preserve it, to maintain the knowledge that sustains it, to pass on the wisdom that makes it possible. The flood is always coming. It may come as literal water, as climate change raises sea levels and intensifies storms. It may come as war, as nuclear weapons or biological agents threaten mass destruction. It may come as technological disruption, as artificial intelligence and automation reshape society in ways we cannot predict. It may come as social collapse, as institutions fail and communities fragment. However it comes, the flood will test us. It will reveal what we have built on solid foundations and what we have built on sand. It will separate the essential from the superficial, the enduring from the temporary. And when it passes, what will remain? What fragments will future generations find when they dig through the ruins of our civilization? What will they make of us? Will they find a king list that helps them understand who we were and what we valued? Or will they find only confusion, a chaos of conflicting messages and meaningless data? These questions should motivate us to think carefully about what we are preserving and how we are preserving it. The Sumerians used clay tablets, a medium that proved remarkably durable, surviving for thousands of years even when buried or submerged. We use digital storage, a medium that is convenient but potentially far more fragile. Hard drives fail, file formats become obsolete, storage media decay. Without active maintenance, digital information can be lost within decades. This is a serious problem for long-term preservation of knowledge. We are creating enormous amounts of information, but very little of it is being preserved in forms that will last for centuries, let alone millennia. Perhaps we need to learn from the Sumerians to create modern equivalents of clay tablets, physical artifacts that encode important knowledge in forms that can survive catastrophes. Some organizations are already doing this, creating time capsules and long-term archives, encoding information in DNA or in patterns etched into durable materials. But these efforts are small-scale and often symbolic rather than comprehensive. We need a more systematic approach to preserving the knowledge that defines our civilization, ensuring that if our digital infrastructure fails, if our complex technological society collapses, future generations will still have access to the essential information they need to rebuild. The King List should inspire us in this project. It shows us that it is possible to create documents that survive for thousands of years, that speak across vast gulfs of time, that preserve essential knowledge even when contexts change and cultures transform. The Sumerians did this without modern technology, using only wet clay and reed styluses, yet their message has reached us clearly across 4,000 years. We have far greater resources and capabilities than they did. We should be able to do at least as well, creating records that will inform and inspire people thousands of years in the future, long after our current civilization has either evolved into something unrecognizable or collapsed into ruin. But beyond practical preservation, the King List offers us something else, a different way of thinking about time and history. It invites us to see ourselves as part of cycles rather than linear progress, to understand that rise and fall are natural processes, that every golden age eventually ends, but that new golden ages can begin. This cyclical view of history is actually more realistic than the linear progress narrative that has dominated Western thought for the past few centuries. When we look at the actual historical record, we see cycles everywhere. Civilizations rise, reach their peak, decline and fall, often to be succeeded by new civilizations that rise in turn. Egypt, Sumer, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome, all rose and fell. Medieval Europe fell into darkness, but eventually experienced a renaissance. China has risen and fallen through multiple dynasties across thousands of years. This pattern repeats because it is natural, because it reflects fundamental processes of growth, maturation, decay, and renewal that operate at all levels of complexity, from individual organisms to entire civilizations. To expect endless linear progress is to deny this reality, to set ourselves up for disappointment and despair when decline inevitably comes. But if we understand history as cyclical, if we see ourselves as part of a larger pattern that includes both rising and falling, both flowering and fading, then we can maintain hope even in times of decline. We know that after fall comes rise again, that after winter comes spring, that the pattern continues. The antediluvian kings represent the peak of the cycle, the golden age when everything was at its best, but they also represent the beginning, the time when patterns were established that would be repeated in later ages. And the flood represents the nadir, the bottom of the cycle, the moment of maximum destruction and chaos. But even the flood is not final. After the flood comes rebuilding, a new rise, a new cycle beginning. Kingship descends again, cities are founded again, civilization returns again. The pattern endures. This is the ultimate message of the king list, and perhaps the reason why the Sumerians preserved it so carefully. It is a message of hope and resilience. It says that no matter how catastrophic the flood, no matter how complete the destruction, recovery is possible. The pattern can be re-established, knowledge can be regained, civilization can rise again. We are not doomed to endless decline or to final extinction. We are part of an eternal cycle, and as long as we remember, as long as we preserve the essential knowledge, as long as we maintain our connection to the pattern, we can rise again after every fall. This is why the king list matters. This is why we should study it, think about it, try to understand it. Not because it will give us precise historical information about events 241,200 years ago, but because it will give us perspective, wisdom, and hope. It will help us understand our place in the vast story of human civilization. It will remind us that we are part of something much larger than ourselves. It will show us that the challenges we face, daunting as they may be, are not unprecedented, that humanity has survived catastrophes before and can do so again, and it will inspire us to do our part in preserving knowledge, maintaining memory, and preparing for the future, so that when the next flood comes, as it surely will, we will have the wisdom and the tools to survive it and to rebuild afterward. The 8 antediluvian kings, Alulim, Alalgar, Enmen-Luana, Enmen-Galana, Dumuzi, Ensipaziana, Enmen-Durana, Ubara-Tutu, are more than ancient names on ancient tablets. They are symbols of endurance, markers of deep time, keys to understanding the cycles that shape our existence. They have waited patiently for over 4,000 years, carved in clay, preserved through countless upheavals, maintained by generation after generation of scribes and scholars who recognize their importance. And now they have reached us in our time with their impossible numbers and their impossible message. They are asking us to remember. They are asking us to think deeply about time and history and civilization. They are asking us to prepare for the future by learning from the past. They are asking us to recognize that the story is much longer and deeper than we imagined. And they are waiting, as they have always waited, for us to finally understand what they have been trying to tell us across the vast abyss of time. 241,200 years, 8 kings, 5 cities, 1 flood. The numbers remain, carved in imperishable clay, speaking across millennia, preserving a truth that we have not yet fully grasped, but that we desperately need to understand. The quest continues, the mystery endures, and the ancient kings wait, patient as stone, ready to reveal their secrets to those who have ears to hear and eyes to see.